34 of Logicast, the AWS News podcast brought to you by Logicata. I'm Carl Robinson, CEO and co-founder of Logicata, and I'm joined, as always, by my colleague, John, as always. Goodall. How are you doing today, John?
You're really labouring that, aren't you? You can't call me John as always Goodall and say you're joined as always by John as always. It's just too much. It's too much.
Editor wouldn't like it, would they? They would. Word would tell me to delete repeated words from the audio.
Yeah.
But I've said it now, so I can't take it back. I'm sorry about that. And we're not joined today by any special guests, which is a real shame. So you're just going to have to put up with me and John as always. So we did have a guest lined up for today. Unfortunately, family commitments got the better of him. So we will be back with guests from the community next week. And hopefully we will be rebooking today's guest for a future episode, which is more convenient for him. So if you're new to the podcast, every week I collate a list of AWS news, which I share via my weekly AWS News Roundup newsletter. And then John and I pick a subset of the articles from the newsletter that we'd like to talk about in more detail. So, of course, we've got a number of articles this week that we would like to discuss. And the first of those is from our friends at The Register. Not quite as sensational as some L-Reg headlines, but amusing nonetheless. The headline of this article is AWS makes its hybrid cloud behave a bit more like normal, boring on-prem servers. So why on earth would we want to do that? Well, of course, AWS's hybrid cloud option is Outposts. So they have a range of form factor options for you to run AWS in your own data center. I think now starting off from a single single rack unit server, going right up to a fully populated rack of network servers and storage that you can run various AWS services on, like EC2, RDS. I think you can run some of the container services on there as well. But what's this article going on about, John? Making its hybrid cloud behave a bit more like normal, boring on-prem servers.
Well, the primary thing here is it's about licensing, which is really not that interesting for an interesting podcast. I like to think we're interesting, but this is quite boring.
Well, we've got boring in the article title, so hopefully we're not setting expectations too high.
No, yeah. Well, we get more interesting as we go. So yeah, as you say, Outposts have a number of offerings from I think 1U or possibly 2U, because a 1U server is only about like that big. They're really tiny. So
1.75 inches. Not sure what that is in metric, but a rack unit is 1.75 inches of height. So.
Yeah, so a 1U server is really small. And so I think they start at either 1 or 2U, and then they go up to a whole rack. What they're doing here is basically meaning that Outpost racks can be configured with whatever hardware you like, and then you can use dedicated hosts within those, so that it's your hardware, it's their hardware that you're renting exclusively in your data center. Right, cool. This is neither here nor there, but what makes it interesting is you can then use dedicated hosts with Outposts. Great, so that you can use some of the cloud services, be a bit more cloudy, start on your cloud migration journey while still being stuck with old per core, per socket, per whatever licensing models for some of your software. So SQL Server is famously bad for this. Oracle is famously bad for this. And Oracle is called out in the article as well, that they're famously bad at licensing on something like a per socket basis, which for listeners that aren't familiar with CPU architectures and how servers are put together, per socket licensing effectively means that everywhere you put a CPU, that has a socket. Okay, laptops, desktops, whatever, have one socket, but servers can have more than one. Yeah, you can have 2, 4, 10, whatever. Mainframes, I think the AS400 and the IBM DB2 were famous for having dozens and dozens of servers and CPUs and sockets, but you just had to unlock them. So you had to pay, someone would come, type in a code and unlock some more CPU for you. And they charge you based on the number of sockets that your system is using, which is, it's a weird model, and it doesn't really work in the cloud space. Oracle are very bad at this. SQL Server have got better. But the idea being is that this allows you to kind of get a bit more cloudy while still using your existing quite expensive licenses whilst you look at migrating to an even more cloudy option potentially.
You said the word socket an awful lot there, and it made me cringe slightly because I'm going to go off on a complete tangent now. I had to empty the socket drawer of my toolbox about 3 times on Saturday looking for a cassette release socket, cassette lock ring release socket for my bicycle as I was maintaining it for a bike ride that I did yesterday. And in the end, after emptying and refilling the socket drawer about 3 times, I had to drive to Halfords and buy another cassette lock ring release socket because I couldn't find the one that I already have. So I just wanted to say the word socket lots of times as well, because you must have said it about 10 times in that previous preamble. So completely irrelevant to AWS and Outpost racks. But yeah, that's my my little anecdote about sockets.
See, the only socket I ever use is a 10mm. Although I did once have to go to Toolstation very rapidly because I'd taken half my car seats out and couldn't get them back in. So I then had to go get some spline bits for my sockets.
Yes, it's always annoying when you have a very extensive tool collection, as I know both you and I do, John, because we can usually see yours in the background. But yeah, when you get halfway through a job and you realize that you haven't got the appropriate tool for the job, and my nearest tool shop is about 3 miles away, so down very slow roads with very slow speed limits. So anyway, but yeah, so I guess the whole dedicated host function, that's something that's always existed within EC2, right? So if you've got this licensing problem in the cloud, so not in the cloud in your data center, but actually in the cloud in Amazon's data centers, you've always been able to do the dedicated hosts thing.
Yeah, but there's some licenses that tie it up to hardware, and then AWS will want to kind of rotate the hardware and all this kind of thing. So this kind of simplifies that somewhat. And it also makes sysadmin types a bit happy because they can see the thing it's assigned to.
Cool. Well, nice to see that new feature being rolled out. I'm not sure what the adoption is like on Outposts.
It's a very specific sort of product. It's not the sort of product that us as consultants would generally see, mostly because our customers are in the small and medium-sized business spaces, and they're not going to have massive data centers full of racks of servers because they might have been running on one server or in a colo or something. This is very much something that the enterprise space, probably regulated, is going to be using.
Yeah, I know we've definitely spoken to some of our customers about it, but we've certainly not seen any of them adopt it just yet. But yeah, it's horses for courses, isn't it? You know, if people have got specific data residency requirements, etc., then potentially this is one way to address it. So, or they've got those products that you mentioned that are still licensing by the socket. There we go. I got to use the word in the correct context. So moving swiftly on from sockets and toolboxes and Outposts racks, the next article we've got is from one of our AWS Hero colleagues. Well, not technically not colleagues, because neither of us are heroes. We're community builders, but AWS Heroes is also an AWS community program. So this is an article published on Dev.to by Yan Cui, who's an AWS hero. And it's about testing step functions, how to skip time when testing timeout and wait states. So this is very much your bag, John, the whole testing of serverless. I know it's something that has been frustrating you quite a bit, perhaps not for this particular reason, but certainly has been frustrating you recently. But I'm not a serverless developer, but I did read the article, and I can imagine how frustrating it might be if you've got a long timeout in your function and you just want to test it and see if it works, and you don't want to have to wait for the duration of the timeout. So yeah, is this something that you might be using yourself, John?
Well, I mean, you've kind of stolen half of what I was going to say about this, but I'll reword. So testing step functions, and everyone that I've spoken to about this that work with step functions in the AWS community. So one of our former guests, one of the chaps that was running a talk at the summit, on the community summit as well, talks about testing step functions. It's always awful. It's always hard. There's no kind of good way of doing it. Put that at the convergence with some of my other work history. I was a software tester for my sins for a little while. And one of the key things that you need to do in software testing is anything that forces an arbitrary wait. So in some retailers, you could put an order in and then cancel it within 30 minutes. So the system's going to sit there and do nothing for 30 minutes. That causes real issues with automated testing suites because they're not built to sit there and wait for 30, 40, 50 minutes, whatever. They can cope with a couple, but not very long. Step functions has the capacity to wait because it needs it for, I want to be triggered by this event and then wait for an hour because the server might be temporary and I'm not going to try and tag something that's not there afterwards, for argument's sake. Testing those workflows that have these big long waits is a pain in the backside because the maximum wait time could be something like 24 hours. And step functions are, the maximum runtime of a step function is a year. So can you imagine testing that has several 2, 3, 4 days worth of waiting and it's allowed to run for 6 months? That's just mad. What this is doing is this is showing you a way. It's not kind of official as such. It's not a new tool. It's just a way that you can subvert that wait to something that's much more palatable. So rather than your wait being 5 minutes, you can create the step function in step functions local and then override that wait state with a much shorter timeout, which means that you can then actually reasonably test it in a normal sort of time frame. And when I say normal, I mean if you look at something like PyTest or Jest for TypeScript, their standard kind of timeouts for tests is 5 or 10 seconds. It's not very long at all. Things need to be executing quickly. So this is a way of solving that problem for step functions with step functions local. I don't like it. I understand it, and I like the description, and I like the article and all that. I don't like that it has to be a thing, because what you're basically doing is you're using code as part of your testing suite to change the code that you're testing. That's okay. It's borderline because you're changing a timeout, but it's quite bad that you should have to be able to do that, really.
So what would you like to do instead?
The problem is I don't see that there's a better option. I'd like to be able to, I get that these things are needed. I get that. I'd like to be able to have a test framework that you can use that does all of that kind of thing for you, where it just nullifies wait states automatically. It sees a wait state and goes, okay, that's now half a second or a second. Doesn't matter what it is. It's just now it's a second, so that you can kind of skim through things much more quickly. I don't like that you kind of have to do it yourself. It's good that it's there. It's nice that it's an option. I don't like that you have to do it yourself. But step functions and serverless is still quite new, so I guess these things will come with time.
Yep, got it. Cool. Okay. So let's skip on then to our next article, which is an article on ITPro today, which is comparing and contrasting two services which allow you to run apps on AWS. AWS Elastic Beanstalk versus Fargate. What are the differences? And when I first read this, I thought, well, there's loads of differences and not many similarities. It's another one of those articles which is just kind of comparing and contrasting two different ways of doing something. And I suppose they could be viable options for the same thing, but often wouldn't necessarily be used in the same scenarios. So, let me not steal your thunder on this one, John. Tell us a bit more about Beanstalk and Fargate and whether or not there are any similarities. Well, that's probably the quickest thing because there's not many.
Yeah, well, you hit the nail on the head in your little preamble there. They are not two services that you would ordinarily compare with each other, primarily because one, Beanstalk, is a service, and the other, Fargate, is actually not a service. It's something that EKS and ECS can use. So it's not a service in and of its own right. So it's not, I'm going to run this on Fargate. No, it's I'm going to run it on ECS Fargate or EKS Fargate. So it's kind of an apples to chalk comparison. They're very different things. You can use them for similar things. I mean, you could draw with an apple, you can eat chalk, but I wouldn't recommend doing either of those things. Where it comes to the similarities is they can both run Docker. That's kind of it, right? You can run Docker containers in a Beanstalk stack. It'll spin up a server for you and it'll deploy your container and it'll kind of run it. Fargate is only running Docker, be that through Kubernetes or through ECS, which I think is like Docker Swarm fundamentally. In terms of the configuration, the similarities and all the rest of it, it's all kind of done through YAML. So I suppose it's sort of the same. Beanstalk doesn't actually use CloudFormation. It runs like on top of CloudFormation and it ports down to CloudFormation. ECS can be done through Fargate for ECS can be done through CloudFormation. So you kind of configure it in a similar sort of way. Yeah, I thought I'd pick this one out because, as I say, it's you wouldn't ordinarily compare them, but it's interesting to see. And I'm kind of stealing an idea from Corey Quinn here. The number of different ways you can run containers in AWS. The reason I say I'm stealing it from him is he's run 3 distinct blogs now on 17 services that run containers in AWS 3 times. So, yeah, it's a bit mad. But yes, you can actually run containers on both of them. Would you want to? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on what you're doing. But I did think it was an interesting thing to compare, hence I picked it out.
Yeah, I think the only real comparison is they're just 2 ways of running applications. But obviously the applications have to be packaged. Well, they don't need to be packaged, I guess, to run on Beanstalk is the one of the benefits of that particular service. So it's less steps required on behalf of the developer, I guess, to get something up and running in Beanstalk. But as I understand it, it is quite a bit more restrictive in terms of what you can actually run.
Yeah, so Beanstalk is it's technically platform as a service, technically. I mean, it's kind of just servers that have been obfuscated, but fundamentally, yes, it's a quick and easy way of getting an application deployed in the cloud and going and running and it doing its thing. Fargate is not that in the slightest, but they're both doing the same thing, which is, I suppose, why they're trying to compare them, in that you don't have to worry about the servers themselves. You worry about, I want my thing to run. Here's what it looks like.
Yeah. Cool. And it goes on to talk about cost. So is there much difference, do you think, in terms of running applications in Beanstalk versus running them in Fargate?
Oh, massively. So Fargate, you don't pay per server. You pay for virtual time, basically. Much like most serverless services, you pay for compute cycles. You don't pay for actual server resources. Beanstalk, it just ties back to EC2. So you pay EC2 rates. Both of them in and of themselves are also actually quite different because Beanstalk itself is a free service. Fargate isn't, because Fargate, as I say, it's not a service in and of its own right. It's a way of running things for a couple of other services. So yeah, again, it's very different. It does make me think why they picked these two, but it's certainly interesting.
Perhaps there's an undercurrent that we're unaware of as to why why these 2 things should be compared. But it's not the first time we've seen apples and chalk compared on the podcast. I can't remember what the previous odd comparisons were, but we've definitely seen them before. Anyway, moving on. We've got our next article from the AWS Training and Certification blog, which is all about updates that are coming to the AWS Certified Cloud Practitioner exam. So I think it's fair to say we both got the Cloud Practitioner exam. You did yours. I did mine a long time ago. So there's probably been many updates since I did mine.
But you did yours so long ago that you forgot that they didn't auto-renew, because you've done so many exams since then that they just kept renewing and you didn't notice.
I thought I needed to do it again, but apparently not. I've still got it. So that's nice. But of course, Cloud Practitioner is the entry level. It's the kind of the first certification available of the, I think, 12 different AWS certifications that you can study and sit exams for. And the Cloud Practitioner certification is really kind of designed more for less technical people, so project managers, commercial people in organizations, etc., just to give them a kind of a high level overview of the basic fundamentals of cloud, a little bit on cloud economics, high level on some of the more commonly used services within AWS, etc. So it's a really good starting point. I think they call it the foundational certification.
It's the foundation level, because the levels are foundation, associate, professional, and then specialty sits off to the side.
So it's actually the only exam that sits in the foundational level, and it's often where people start their AWS certification journeys before they then go on to study for some of the more specialist exams. So, so this article is talking about some changes that are coming from the 18th of September or the 19th of September, 2023. So talk us through the changes, John. What's going to be different for people sitting their Cloud Practitioner exam from the 19th of September onwards?
Yeah, so the article itself does kind of give you this breakdown. The 4 domains are still the same-ish. they've kind of expanded them a little bit. So this is actually only the first time that Cloud Practitioner has been refreshed. We're now on the 3rd generation of Solutions Architect. We're on the 2nd generation now of Dev Associate DevOps. Don't know about SysOps. And I suspect the specialty exams have been refreshed a couple of times as well. But yes, this is the first time that this has been refreshed. So this is actually long overdue, because the Cloud Practitioner exam basically didn't reflect reality. So they've now kind of updated it, which is good. In terms of the changes, the first 2 domains, well, there's 4 domains. There's, in the old exam, there's Cloud Concepts, Security and Compliance, Technology, and Billing and Pricing, right? 4. In the new one, there's Cloud Concepts, Security and Compliance, same. Now it's Cloud, Technology and Services, rather than just Technology, and Billing, Pricing and Support. So they've put another thing on the end there. So they've subtly changed what the domain areas are. I suspect if you could pass the old one, you'd be able to pass the new one without learning anything new. But the domains are subtly different. And they've changed the weightings a little bit as well. So in the old one, Cloud Concepts was 26%. In the new one, it's 24%. Security and Compliance in the old one was 25%. It's now 30%. So there's an enhanced kind of view that security and compliance is more important. Technology was 33%. It's now Technology and Services is now 34%. So that's kind of about the same. And Billing and Pricing has dropped from 16% to Billing, Pricing and Support at 12%. So what they've functionally done is they've pinched a bit from concepts and billing and added it onto security. So they've kind of said, no, we think security needs more kind of a focus than these other areas do. It was already it wasn't the highest, and it's still not the highest, because Technology and Services is still the highest, but it's coming much higher up the chain now. It was 3rd, it's now 2nd, and not by anywhere near as much of a margin either. There's a couple of bits that they've added. So Domain 1 now includes things covered by the Cloud Adoption Framework, which was updated in 2021. So this is not new. This is not new by any measure, but it was a case of the exam not reflecting reality. Domain 2 now includes higher level governance and some more services. Domain 3 now has more topics broken down, so databases, network, storage, and so on, which it didn't have before. And Domain 4 is now support as a consolidated topic rather than kind of being split between the other domain areas. So it kind of makes sense. In terms of training, the training is kind of no different, really. The content of the training will be different, but the way you train for it's going to be pretty well the same. It's go off a new skill builder. That's kind of the recommendation, because it's free, it's self-paced, it's gamified, it's online. You just go and use it. It doesn't cost you anything, rather than spending 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 pounds on a third-party kind of slides-based course. And I know you and I prefer those sorts of things, but a free training is always what AWS are going to kind of push you towards, because it's free, you know.
Yeah.
Great.
Why not? And if you want to fly around on a hoverboard solving business challenges in a virtual world, you can do it that way as well. I think I'm a bit old for that one. It's kind of passed me by, but
I mean, I'm not that old that gamified anything annoys me. It's just, I don't know. I just, if I do it kind of the traditional slide-based way with demos and all the rest of it, it feels much more like university did, with lectures and workshops and all that sort of thing. So I suppose that's just kind of what I'm used to.
Yeah, exactly. Same here. For me, games are games and learning is learning, but those worlds are obviously converging. So school and university was incredibly boring when I went. There was no fun element of it at all, not on the learning side anyway. Obviously, outside of the
Student union bar,
lecture theatre, then there was plenty of fun to be had. But yeah, that's an entirely different podcast. So let's move on to our final article for this week, and this one is on InfoQ, and it's a fairly short article, but we've touched on this. I think we've mentioned a couple of times about Spot Instances and how the Spot instance market is changing. So this article is kind of summarizing a third-party study that's been done into the spot market. So I suppose, John, maybe it's worth starting with a quick definition of spot instances for anyone who's not familiar, and then be interested to hear your thoughts on what's going on in the spot instance market.
Yeah, sure. So for those unfamiliar, there are a number of different ways of procuring your EC2 resource. God, I sound so businessy these days. I've been listening to you too much. So there's a number of different ways of running things in EC2. You can use on demand, which is just give me server, please. You can use reserved instances, which is I will have this server for X amount of time. You can use another type of reserved instance, which I'll have this type of server for X amount of time. You can then apply compute savings plans and EC2 savings plans over the top of your on-demand resources, because you've guaranteed that you're going to spend this much money in these categories and they give you a cheaper price. And you can use spot instances. Spot instances do benefit from your compute savings plans because it's just spend in the category. But the way a spot instance works is, unlike an on-demand or a reserved instance that you say, I will have this and it will be yours forevermore if you keep paying it and leave it on, a spot instance, you pay significantly less. It was something like 10 or 20% of the price of an on-demand instance when they first came out. But AWS don't guarantee that that server will always be yours. They can take it back with, I think, a 2 or a 3 minute notice period if they need the capacity for somebody else to have an on-demand or a reserved instance somewhere else. So basically what they're doing is they're flogging off their unused compute to you for cheap so that they can kind of maximize the unit economics effectively. Spot instances are really good for very specific workloads, things that can tolerate being interrupted, things that are stateless or where state is managed not on the server, that kind of thing. They work quite nicely with things like ECS and EKS because with the right scheduling tools, if an instance goes down somewhere, you can just bring another one up somewhere else. And so long as you have your minimum instances set and your system is set up that if it can't get spot instances, it will just pull up an on-demand instance because they're pretty well always available in on-demand, then it works quite nicely. And I've built EKS clusters using this before with things like pod auto-scaling and cluster scaling and that kind of thing. So the idea being that a server will occasionally get destroyed, you get a little bit of notice, so your system brings a new one up, moves your pods over, moves your containers over, the other one gets binned off, and you didn't even notice because it just kind of all happened. And that works really well. It does. It's great. But they don't work for things that can't tolerate being interrupted. So you wouldn't necessarily want to run your big data processing workloads, for argument's sake, on them. Right. That's the definition. That's a very long definition. In terms of what's happening with the pricing, is they're just getting more expensive. And you're kind of seeing this in the graph. And honestly, I like a graph because graphs are really easy to digest. I know you like a graph.
Love a graph. Yeah, especially a pie chart.
This is not a pie, I'm afraid. This is a line graph that I don't like the look of, because what it's kind of showing is that in areas where prices are spiking, they're going really high comparatively to what they used to be. Yeah, they're still really tiny numbers. It's like 0.00025 of a dollar to 0.00175 of a dollar. So it's gone from 1/4% of a dollar to like 1% of a dollar. So it's like it's gone up significantly, but the numbers are quite small. Why do we think this is? Why do we think they're getting more expensive? Well, I have a couple of guesses. And chip shortage, that's been rumbling on now for 4 years. It's not going away. Nvidia are really guilty of this because they're just not spitting GPUs out quickly as they could. GPU shortage on top of the generic chip shortage is another thing. Just things are harder to get hold of generally, which is presumably why AWS are pushing the Graviton thing, because they can kind of control their own manufacturing a lot better.
Yeah. It's just basic supply and demand. I think the article says it in here. Isn't this just a case of if more people are using Spot at the same time, there's less Spot instances available? That's what it is. I think a lot of people have cottoned onto this. I do wonder what's going to happen to the kind of third-party market of tools to help you manage Spot instances, etc., because it seems like all roads are leading to savings plans at the moment. I think we spoke about this on the podcast last week, that now the pricing tool, the AWS pricing tool, when you go for the through the pricing options section, savings plans are front and center and reserved instances are hidden. And it seems that potentially AWS are trying to discourage Spot usage as well.
I don't think that that's fair, because your compute savings plans, I think, apply to Spot instances as well, because it's just a different type of server, whereas reserved instances versus savings plans are more of a billing instrument. So I don't think that's a fair comparison. But yes, it's unit economics. More people are using them, there's less available. And every so often, AWS will come out with an article saying, here's how you can maximize your Spot usage. We saw one 4 or 5 weeks ago and discussed it on the pod, where they say make sure that you're spread across AZ, try and be multi-region, those kind of things. If there's not a lot of demand in say Stockholm region, so can you run your workloads there, that kind of thing. But yes, I think it's basic economics. More people are using them and there's less GPUs and things available, so AWS are building out data centers slower than they used to be.
Cool. Well, on that note, we've reached the end of our time available today. So
that was much harder without a guest. I didn't like it.
You had to do a lot more talking. Even I did a bit more talking than I usually do. So yeah, but we'll be back next week with a guest, hopefully. We've certainly got a good, strong pipeline of guests booked in for the next few episodes of Logicast. So, excuse me.
Oh, he's dying. Whilst he dies, I'll do the exit, shall I? So you can get Logicast on any major platform where you normally get your podcast. Please do subscribe and download. It really feeds the ego, and we get some really nice graphs. We will see you, speak to you, sort of, next time.